You found yourself on another episode of Locked On Bulls. The Chicago Bulls continue filling out Billy Donovan's coaching staff, hiring Dan Craig, another tenured veteran assistant coach. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're also going to look at former Bulls in the playoffs and why it kind of highlights how the Bulls roster construction over the last few years has really put the Bulls in a situation to not get the most out of certain players. And then lastly, we're going to talk about should the Chicago Bulls trade up or trade back in the NBA draft. We're going to get into all that and more right after this.
You are Locked On Bulls, your daily Chicago Bulls podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked On Bulls, member of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every single day. I'm Haize, host and creator of Chicago Bulls Central and Chicago Bears Central YouTube pages and podcasts. Pat the designer's out today. Nonetheless, we're going to hold it down without Pat. It's no big deal. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedon and use code all lowercase LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That being said, let's go ahead and get into it, man. So, listen, the Chicago Bulls have continued now to fill out Billy Donovan's coaching staff. And, you know, they're looking and they're adding some really tenured veteran coaches. This time now hiring Dan Craig to the Chicago Bulls roster. This is a guy who shares a lot of the same story as far as Eric Spoelstra. Coming from the Heat organization, he worked himself up through their video department team, going all the way up to eventually being one of the leads of player development down there. He also was the head coach of their G League team down there for a while. And this is just adds on, like the Bulls who already hired Wes Unseld Jr. as the lead assistant coach. Both these guys are now going to be operating as lead assistants for the Chicago Bulls. And this is a step in the right direction. Do I think like this is this crazy thing that's just going to do a whole hell of a lot for the Bulls? You know, that remains to be seen, but I do think, you know, changing the voices in that locker room, right? Getting a new set of eyes. When you look at both of the guys that the Bulls have hired, hell, Dan Craig is a three-time NBA champion as an assistant coach, so he's been with an organization that has kind of known how to operate, right? And so, yeah, he moved on from that to different teams and things like that. He worked with the Clippers also under Tyronn Lue. So depending on how you view Tyronn Lue, again, another solid coach that he's worked underneath. And some coaches are just better as assistants, right? So something I look at is Wes Unseld Jr., his tenure with the Denver Nuggets. I just look at Wes Unseld as somebody who's probably better at that assistant role. And Dan Craig could be that as well. Or I do have a conspiracy theory on that. We'll talk about that here in a second. But I like what the Bulls are doing here as far as adding veterans, right? Me and Pat have talked a lot about, wanting to have coaches on the back end of the bench with Billy Donovan that have better situational awareness, right? That have strengths in some of the things that he lacks in. I love the fact that both these veteran coaches that we've brought in also have been heads of player development, right? And so, that's something that the Bulls have been really shoddy on lately is player development over the last few years. We know that last season we added a whole player development staff, but to have some assistant coaches that are there to help guide, that are traveling with the team day in and day out. I don't think that the player development department is traveling with the team every single game, but your assistant coaches will be. So having, that staff fleshed out with these veteran, long tenured assistants, I think it's going to be good for the Chicago Bulls. And, reportedly the Bulls also interviewed Dwayne Casey, David Fizdale as well, former head coaches as well. And it seems like that was the focus of the Bulls in this assistant coaching stretch, is to find people that had prior head coaching experience. And so, shout out to the Bulls for doing that, man. So, I know a lot of kind of the more pessimistic Bulls fans are asking, well, how much does this change? Billy Donovan is still the head coach. Is he going to trust these veterans? And, per what me and Pat talked about on the last episode after the Wes Unseld hiring, is that I think these feel like AK moves, right? And not to say that Billy Donovan didn't have a place in them as well. I think he was definitely had a place in the decisions also. This wasn't AK just saying, oh, no, these are your assistants. But I do think that AK wanted a specific type of person to fit this role, to be on the back end of the bench to help out Billy Donovan. And when Arturas had his season-ending press conference, and he talked about change. And we know that the roster still needs change. These moves do not negate the fact of the roster needing change for the Chicago Bulls. This still does. We still got to figure out a better balance there, which is part of what we'll talk about here in the second segment. But outside of just that change that you need on the roster, you also need a change of voice. You need a new set of eyes on things. And I think a lot of times new sets of eyes really do help kind of add new perspectives. And especially when they're guys that are really respected, like a Dan Craig, like a Wes Unseld, I think that's going in the right direction. Now, I said earlier, you guys are familiar with this theory that working theory me and Pat have had. I do think that the Bulls are preparing for a succession plan in case, right? And by that, I mean, if Mark Eversley, if and when, I think it's more of a win than an if, Mark Eversley does move on, I do really think that Billy Donovan is going to get consideration to move into the front office. And there are a lot of Bulls fans that aren't going to like that, and I understand it, right? I think some of Billy Donovan's skills and things that he thrived at in college actually could be things that work for him in a GM role, being head of player scouting, right? Things like that, being, as entrenched in the college game, stuff like that, recruiting, right, is something that he also did in college. So, a college coach does act more like a GM than just a coach. So, but I feel like the reasons why I think that is just simply Billy Donovan is entrenched with this ownership group. And we know as long as you don't badmouth ownership, as long as you don't go against ownership, they tend to keep you around in some shape, form, or fashion. John Paxson is still getting a check from the Chicago Bulls. He still is listed on the Bulls directory as having a role with the Bulls. Doug Collins still on the Chicago Bulls payroll as well, right? These are guys like Joakim Noah still there as a ambassador and things like that. So I do think that there is a path and enough reason to think that if and when Mark Eversley does move on, Billy Donovan is going to have a chance to move into the front office. Now, I've heard nothing about that. Billy Donovan's never talked, to my knowledge, about, any type of front office duties or anything like that. But just knowing this franchise and knowing, what we've seen from this franchise over years, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. Not saying that Dan Craig or Wes Unseld are immediately going to be thrust into the head coaching position, but I do think they'll get a chance to interview. And I do think that they'll, after being here in this organization, being familiar with the players, that they'll get that opportunity to take a look and see if that's something that the Bulls feel comfortable in them doing. So, that's where the coaching staff sits right now. We still have one remaining spot on this roster. So when you look at it now, on the coaching staff, you got Billy Donovan as the head coach. Dan Craig and Wes Unseld Jr. are going to be operating as the lead assistants. You got John Bryan on the back end of that bench. And we have one more spot left there. And I, for one, hope that, while they've gone veterans with their lead assistants, I do hope they find another young, promising coach to kind of fill in the last spot on that coaching staff. Personally, that's just my personal thought and opinion on it. Doesn't mean necessarily it's going to happen. They could go veterans as well. But I think if you've already interviewed David Fizdale as well as Dwayne Casey, I personally think that probably means that maybe you're going to go a different route if you didn't offer them another position. Those guys probably wouldn't have taken a back end of coaching position either. They probably would have only taken a lead assistant role there. So the Bulls still got another decision to make with the coaching staff. And, overall, I think this is a step in the right direction to show that change is at the forefront of the front office's mind. How successful this change is, that remains to be seen. Does not negate, as I said earlier, the other changes that need to happen with this roster. But for right now, adding 2 veteran assistants that have really thrived at that role, I think this is a good step for the Chicago Bulls. I really do. You never really know just how much assistants really have a say, right? It really comes down to the coach. We always go back to kind of Tom Thibodeau and how he was basically the defensive coordinator for that championship Boston Celtics team. Doc Rivers didn't coach the defense. That was a Tom Thibodeau thing. He was calling the plays. He was calling the adjustments. The players were going to him for defensive assignments. And I'm not saying that Billy Donovan is going to be willing to turn over the reins that much, but hopefully in having 2 guys, one that's very familiar with AK, their voices are used and maximized a lot, so where they can have a say, have a different perspective on things, come in during this draft process as well, as the Chicago Bulls are still trying to decide on who they want to draft and bring into this roster. All those things I think are pointing to, a solid direction. I'm not saying it's great. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying we're done, right? I'm not even saying that this is necessarily enough. We don't know if this is enough yet. We don't know the level of impact that this is going to have for sure yet. But I am saying that I do hope that this ends up being decisions that we look back on and that we say are the right decisions. But, next up, we're going to be talking about former Bulls in the playoffs, mainly just Derrick Jones Jr. and how kind of him being used more to his strengths has really helped him thrive in the playoffs with the Dallas Mavericks. But before we get into that, I got to talk to you guys about one of our sponsors, and that is Yahoo Finance. This is a new sponsor here over with Locked On, and so we appreciate those guys for coming over. Let's get straight to the point. You want to grow your portfolio to deal with the rising cost of inflation, to pay off your debt or your mortgage, pretty much anything standing in the way of you and financial freedom, right? Well, Yahoo Finance, you can get access to the news, data, and tools that you need in order to help reach that financial freedom. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or you're looking to get that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data you need all in one place. They are the #1 finance destination, producing holistic look at financial news cycle, including breaking news, original editorial perspectives, analysis, independent research, customizable charts, and so much more. So securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401k and other investments. A comprehensive perspective is what sets apart great investors, and it's how Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. With the community of over 90 million users each month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. For a comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com. That's #1 financial destination. That's Yahoo Finance, yahoofinance.com. We also got another sponsor we got to talk to you guys about as well, and that's one that you guys should be very familiar with, and that is PrizePicks. Get in on the playoff action and win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during basketball's postseason. PrizePicks has something for every sports fan, from baseball and hockey to League of Legends and everything in between. You can pick LeBron, Caitlin Clark, Connor McDavid, or Jude Bellingham all in the same entry. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That's PrizePicks, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. All right, y'all. With that said, guys, let's go ahead and get into the next topic, in which I want to talk about Bulls players in the playoffs. Daniel Gafford. I'm going to just touch on that real quick, because Daniel Gafford, he's been so good since he left the Bulls. And really, in hindsight, the Bulls could have really used him. Now, I don't think he would have ever gotten the contract that he's on right now for the Chicago Bulls. The thing is, the Bulls would have had, I think, 1 to 2 more years of him being under a cost-controlled contract. But, it is what it is there. But one of the players that have stood out the most to me when you look at it is Derrick Jones Jr. He's been such a immaculate role player for the Dallas Mavericks team, especially in that last playoff series. And you got to give it credit. Now, while he's always showed flashes here, right? I don't think anybody would say, like, Derrick Jones Jr. is one of those players that just always showed something. He always found a way to impact the game of basketball all the time, right? And while his stats last season aren't going to blow you out the water at 8.6 points per game, but he shot the ball 48% from the field, and he shot the ball 34% from three, taking 3.5 3-pointers per game, highest marks in his NBA career. And then when you look at that on top of it, when you look at it last season with the Chicago Bulls, Derrick Jones Jr. played 85% of his minutes at the 4. However, this season with Dallas, he's played 48% of his minutes at the 3 and 50% of his minutes at the 4. What that means is that putting him out on the perimeter more consistently has gotten the best out of Derrick Jones Jr. And that is the thing and been the struggle with the roster. When we talk about things like this roster needs change, that is part of the reason why we say things like that. It's simply because of player usage. And, we had to use Derrick Jones Jr. as a 4 and backup 5 at times, because we were just lacking on this roster. Derrick Jones Jr. started 66 games out of the 76 games he played for Dallas last season, averaging 23.5 minutes per game in that time. And so when you look at it as well, under Billy Donovan, 14 minutes per game in 2022-23. It's crazy when you look at those numbers, right? The way that you use players are almost as important as the players that you have on your roster. And the thing with the Bulls is, and where our roster has been and where we struggled at so much as a team, we've had to consistently use players in positions that aren't best suited for them. Now, one could say that, well, Haize, he's still playing about half his minutes at the 4. Yeah, but it's also how they use him at the 4. The number of three-point attempts that he's getting is considerably different than how they've been having to use him. So it's when you watch the games, like I said, his numbers aren't going to wow you or anything like that. But when we talk about the change that's needed to this roster for the Chicago Bulls, that is a big thing of what we're talking about. It's making a roster that makes more sense so you can use players better to their strength. That's always been my biggest knock on Billy Donovan, outside of, the inbound calls and things like that, is that player utilization. We don't use players to their strength. We know that Zach LaVine off catch and shoots is damn near elite. We don't get a chance to run very many catch and shoot opportunities for him. We just don't. You got DeMar DeRozan and Nikola Vucevic, who both start their offense off basically from the same areas. They finish in different places, but that's clogged the lane, right? Then you have, between injury and our thinness at the big man position at the 4 and the 5, we've had to use players like Alex Caruso, Javonte Green, right, out of position. And that is one thing that I really hope that however we change this roster this year, that we can use Javonte, for example, if we retain him, more on the wing, because I do think that that's where he would thrive at majorly for the Chicago Bulls, right? And so hopefully this is also a wake-up call when we talk about the change and the new eyes and the things that a new coaching staff would bring. I really hope that player utilization and finding out different ways to use some of the players you already have, because what we know, right, while some Bulls fans are calling for it, a full rebuild is not coming. A full teardown of this roster isn't coming. I would not be surprised if about 90% of the roster is back next year, and that just is what it is, right? And so with whatever changes you make, I just hope that we start using players better. I'm tired of seeing players leave the Chicago Bulls and go and be better. And while you have a lot of Bulls fans that call for this full rebuild, that say, trade everyone, you don't need to trade everyone. Some of these players we're going to get more out of and get a completely different view of them just by using them correctly. And when you have young players like a Dalen Terry, a Julian Phillips, right? These guys that are young, unproven, right? Talented, that hopefully you start figuring out the best way to use them for their skill set rather than trying to fit them in a specific role, right? Same thing could be said with Patrick Williams. I'm not a guy who looks at Patrick Williams and says he needs to be a 3. A lot of Bulls fans do. I have issues with Patrick Williams at the 3, in my opinion. But if that's how you view it, right? If that ends up being the right decision to make with Patrick Williams, you got to be willing and have a perspective to be able to make those changes and put these players in the right situations. And so let's hope that ends up being the case, man. It's just, like I said, I hate to drum up trauma and things like that, but it really does come down to that. I am tired of seeing Bulls players go and thrive somewhere else. And Derrick Jones Jr. has been so important. It hasn't just been him. Like I said, Daniel Gafford, Derek Lively, right? The role players that for the Dallas Mavericks really stepped up in that last series to help get them to a Western Conference Finals, right? So, that's another thing. Role players matter. Role players matter. And that is why I fight against, right, Bulls fans that act like just because somebody's a role player doesn't mean that they can't be hugely impactful and effective. You just got to use them right. They have to also have the right mindset, right? They got to be able to understand their strengths as well and play to those strengths. But you got to create a situation and an environment where you're able to play players to their strengths. And right now, the Bulls have just been holding on for everything that they can for dear life, right? We haven't been able to focus on using players to what they're best because we just got to fill in bodies where we can, because between injuries, between, all that other stuff, we just haven't been able to do that. That's what I really hope comes out of this next phase for the Chicago Bulls. More than anything is clarity on player utilization, a roster that makes more sense from top to bottom, right? And it may take some time to get there. It may not get there all in one offseason. And I know a lot of Bulls fans are holding out that hope, but there's going to be a big chance. There's going to a couple of realities that we eventually need to talk about that are going to happen this offseason for the Bulls. One, we're probably going to be hugely disappointed by the Zach LaVine trade return. That's just going to happen. It's going to happen. Be wary of it. Two, the Bulls are probably going to go best player available in this draft, despite the centers that are available in this draft. I just would not be surprised if they go best player available. And some could say, hey, that maybe what needs to happen, right? Because we need the talent. And three, like, some of the things that we hope and wish for that are pie in the sky ideas just aren't coming. Billy Donovan isn't being fired, right? DeMar DeRozan may very well be back here in the Chicago Bulls uniform. The Bulls may not hold on to their 2025 first-round pick because they're going to try to make it go for it this year. There's a lot of things this offseason that, the clarity isn't coming on, but some of it is. And I think, and I hope that we can start getting on the path to where we can see more of that clarity. And even though we're still going to have questions on, all right, how do we bring it all home? But at least we can start seeing that full picture a little bit more for the Chicago Bulls. But you guys can let me know what you guys think on all that, as always, down below. But with that said, we're going to next up finish the show and talking about the Bulls in the draft. Should they trade down in the NBA draft? Before we get into that, though, I do got to talk to you guys about another one of our sponsors, and that is FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on and make every playoff shot count. Again, guys, playoffs are fun. It's been a very kind of unpredictable playoffs in a lot of ways. I know that the Boston Celtics versus the Indiana Pacers seem like it's just going to go away. I wouldn't be surprised if the Boston Celtics sweep. But the Western Conference Finals is going to be very exciting with Minnesota, with Dallas. If you guys want to bet on that, again, visit FanDuel.com/locked-on and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Visit FanDuel.com to look at the odds at any time as well, guys. All right, y'all. With that said, let's get into the last topic that we have today on the docket, and that is talking about the Bulls' potential to trade up or down. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about this just a little bit, right, and we'll continue having player profiles and getting into the weeds of specific players and things like that. I've been doing a deep dive over on Chicago Bulls Central. If you guys want to check that out, I think we're about 30 prospects deep at this point. Sounds about right. Probably about 28, 30 prospects deep. But there's a lot of, if the Bulls are going to go position of need, is center, right? And there are a lot of centers in this draft that you can get late, right? And it depends really on who takes what where, right? Because you can have a player like Kyle Filipowski, who I really like, that in some mocks is going in the top 12, in others he's going in the bottom 20, right? Khalil Ware, another guy that I'm super high on. Missy is another Missy, another one that I've recently started doing my deep dive on his tape. I like him a lot as well. These guys could be gotten very much lower in the draft. And the reason why I say that, right, is that with the Bulls being as cash strapped as they are, depending on what moves that they can make, if you can move down in this draft and pick up a second round pick, right? And I get it. I know some people are already getting ready to type, but Haize, this is a weak draft. The players suck in this draft. It's a weak draft as far as star level talent. There's still some players that can be starters, that can be role players, that can be average role players and above average role players in this league. And so if the Bulls were to pick up another low first round pick, for example, or trade down, get somebody's pick and get a second round pick, they could have the potential to go position of need and maybe more upside. And I hope that the Bulls are willing to listen to all offers in this, because they have to. And if they do end up moving a player like a Zach LaVine or moving a player like Alex Caruso, not necessarily saying I want them to move Alex Caruso, if they can obtain another pick in this draft and do that, I think you may have to explore those options. We'll see if it ends up happening, right? I think more the best case scenario, or the most likely case scenario, is that the Bulls just stay at number 11. They take whoever the best on their board is. Could that end up being a reach? Could be, but if you get the player that you need and you have number 1 on your board, are you really worried about reaching if you truly have them at number 1 on your board? Of course, I would like to see more of a Ryan Poles type attack to this, the GM of the Chicago Bears. I would love to see that kind of more of an approach, only because, Ryan Poles is somebody who, if he can get his guy and get some more assets, he will, right? And take advantage. But it really the draft is so fluid. And this is a draft where you literally can get somebody who can go number 8, or they can go number 18. And that happens all up and down this draft. And so, with that volatility of it, is that you may want to just hold on to your own pick, maybe trade a player or something like that if you do want to get into the second round. The Bulls have bought second round picks before, right? We know that they're not against doing that. Maybe you look to do that to get another player in this draft if you even see fit. The Bulls may be waiting and holding on to assets to get additional picks in the 2025 draft, which a pick in the 20s in next year's draft in 25 is like a top 10 pick this year. So that could be the option that the Bulls do as well. But I do hope that they're open for business on draft day, at least listening to deals to see what they can do to maneuver to really improve this team. That's the overall takeaway that I want to have from this, is that whether the Bulls trade up, trade down, whether they stay the same, whatever, I do hope the Bulls are active in seeing at least what's out there for the team. And the reason why is because we do need talent. We are right up against that luxury tax. We are going to have a difficulty fledging out a full roster if we keep DeMar, if we keep Patrick Williams, if we keep both those guys. We're going to have difficulty doing that and staying under the luxury tax while improving the team at all. So I think the Bulls need to be open to listen to everything in cases like that. Will they? Listen, AK sees the world very differently than a lot of humans, so you can't necessarily bet on that. But I guess we'll see what ends up coming of that. But guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you guys are following the show at Locked On Bulls. You can follow Pat over at Pat the Designer. You can follow me at CEO Haize, that's CEO Haize. I appreciate you guys so much for tuning in. Locked On Bulls is free and available on every podcasting app and platform of your choice, as well as YouTube and the Odyssey app. Also, Fire TV. You can check us out over there as well. But that's our time for today. For Pat the Designer, this has been Locked On Bulls, y'all. Peace.